Now, as the last part of this section, we go through a few examples of other long-term or related long-term radiation effects. First, I'd like to mention the concept of radiation-enhanced diffusion, sometimes abbreviated RED, which in general means that during radiation, diffusion of a regular species may be enhanced. And a sort of simple and pretty well-known example is that a self-interstitial may bind with an impurity to form a mobile mixed defect which moves much faster than the regular interstitial. This has, for instance, been known to happen for boron in silicon. And as an example of this, bit more detail on this boron in silicon, this was an effect studied a lot in the 1990s when it became important for understanding silicon processing and silicon implantation. And by now it's a well understood effect. And the best work is done by the group called Lourdes Pelas in Valladolid in Spain, who are able to simulate this with object kinetic Monte Carlo in great detail. And this, without going into details, this is just an example how KMC simulations can get not perfect, but still quite a good agreement with the experimental data under different conditions on the formation of boron interstitial clusters. Well, another very important long-term end result of irradiation in metal is in metals where you get dislocations. And very often when you radiate metals for a long time, as mentioned earlier, they never amorphize. They retain basically their crystal structure, but they can get a quite large concentration of dislocations. And often these are seen as dislocation loops, which is essentially a roughly circular loop of an a dislocation, which then in the TM electron microscopy looks like it has this due to the strain field, a contrast around it as well. And these kind of dislocation loops will be discussed in some more detail in the next section. This is just showing one of many images of dislocation loops in irradiated metals. And this production of the dislocations in metals during prolonged irradiation can also be modeled with molecular dynamics. This animation here we show a number of massive number of overlapping 5 kV cascades in nickel. And this was pure molecular dynamics, so the time scale between the events is many orders of magnitude higher than in typical experiments. But the qualitative effects we think are still roughly correct, and there's worth showing here. So what happens is that when you start irradiating this, so in this case we had, like in the case of silicon, we had many 5 kV recoils in the same simulation cell, and follow what happens. And this is an atomic image showing all the atoms in the cell, so you see through the cell. As you can see, the cell indeed never amorphizes, but you keep getting large dislocation structures here. So these extended things are dislocation loops like the ones shown earlier. And as you can also see, there are smaller defects which are highly mobile. These highly mobile things are small interstitial clusters which are moving around quite rapidly. Because this is a cell with all periodic boundary conditions, the atoms cannot vanish, so there is certainly a number of vacancies as here as well. But you do see that you have quite highly mobile things, and these can be analyzed and shown to be dislocations. So now in this animation, the exact same sequence of collision cascades is shown, but now they are, instead of plotting atoms, they are analyzed with an analysis known as the dislocation extraction algorithm, implemented in a code called Ovito, which analyzes dislocations in the structure. And you see that indeed you start building up dislocations here. In here, I mean, the cyan is sort of a perfect dislocation, Shockley is a partial dislocation, and these purple things are what's known as steroid dislocations. Never mind that these are you don't know exactly what they are now. In the next section we will discuss these dislocations in much more detail, but you do see that you get quite large peculiar dislocation structures here, but eventually the dominant, after a very long irradiation, the dominant feed should be these perfect dislocations which can form and reform due to the irradiation. Also, these steroid dislocations, it's actually this funny looking shape is actually a tetrahedron, and these so-called stacking fault tetrahedra have been seen many times experimentally in irradiated nickel. And one can analyze these simulations in detail and see how a pre-existing heat spike can affect pre-existing damage. So in this case, one can actually see how you get a collision cascade. It will form here, and this dislocation cascade will affect the nearby damages. So this was a single cascade, number 450 out of all these 5 kV cascades. And if you look at this closely, you see that this damage structure, which was pre-existing, changed due to the dislocation. Sorry, due to the heat spike. And in a dislocation picture, this Oviedo dislocation analysis, one can see that sometimes these heat spikes can completely change the structure of a dislocation. In this case, a complicated 1/2/1 dislocation changed into a 1/0 dislocation structure. So this was to give a bit of an idea what things can look like in metals. Going back to semiconductors, one can have additional things. In some semiconductors, best known is germanium, simply the element germanium. If you radiate germanium by pretty much anything for a long time, you'll get a porous structure of it. So this is 1 MeV germanium irradiation, initially crystalline germanium. You see here at the bottom is the perfect crystal. And here you see that you have a very strange, complicated porous network of germanium that has formed. This is something which nobody has been able to fully explain. It's believed to be related to vacancy migration and coalescence, but it's not been possible by any simulation means to reproduce this kind of porosity formation as far as I know. And these voids can also, similar porosity can also form in metals. If you have, of course, form a lot of voids in a material, the atoms have to go somewhere. Typically, they go to the surface, so this means that the whole material swells. And these effects can be quite significant. In metals, under neutron irradiation, which penetrates the whole sample, this is some 316 steel which was irradiated in a nuclear reactor at 533 degrees C for a very long time with neutrons, and you see that eventually this irradiated sample, you see that it's both higher, macroscopically higher, several millimeters higher, and wider than the initial sample. This is, of course, something which really has to be considered when building nuclear reactors. Any engineer can tell you that if you have something like this 5% extension of a material, it's really not something you want to have an engineering structure. Most likely the whole thing would be destroyed by this. Fortunately, there are metals where these swelling effects are much less out of steels. So-called ferritic martensitic steels are known to not show almost any kinds swelling, are considered promising for and are used in nuclear reactors with high neutron irradiation environments. Regular nuclear reactors run now. They're because they are water moderated, these high energy neutrons which cause this effect almost are not present, and because of that this issue is not nearly as severe in most current nuclear reactors. And I'd also like to briefly mention another exciting long-term effect of irradiation, which is on surfaces, which is known as ripple formation. That is, under many surfaces, when you irradiate them with an ion beam, after even if it's perfectly flat to begin with, after a while you can get beautiful wave-like ripple forms like here. Here you see this was an initially flat surface, but then this happens only at some angles. So if you change the angle, you don't get any ripples, and then on a third angle, you can get very complicated nanostructure formation, which is also all self organized. And so this is just as an illustration that you can also on surfaces get many exciting long-term surface effects, long-term irradiation effects. This ripple formation is pretty well understood. There is an analytical theory by Bradley and Harper and many modifications of it, which can explain it due to sputtering. Well, the most recent evidence indicates that in many cases it's not actually caused by sputtering, but atom flow, which leads to an instability in the surface height function. But in both of these, just to give you a flavor, one describes it with a differential equation, which describes how the surface height as a function of position x, y, and time changes with time as a function of how irradiation sputters or makes material flow as a function of the incoming angle. The key point here is that on a flat surface, the incoming angle is the same everywhere, but if you start forming by random processes, any changes, both the sputtering yield and the atom flow the local incoming angle, once you have induced some roughening, will change, and then you get a different kind of either sputtering or atom flow, and this eventually leads to an instability, which can lead to ripple formation. And finally, I'd like to mention segregation. And this is called, can be very important and interesting from a practical point of view. That if you irradiate something, you can get materials to segregate into precipitates or even into layers. And this rather obviously happens if you have a material which is made but is not thermodynamically soluble, and then the radiation may lead to segregation. Sometimes radiation can also drive materials into segregation when they are thermodynamically stable. And the reason I mentioned this is practically interesting and a quite timely topic is that this segregation can be utilized to make nanocrystals in materials. And the basic idea for this is illustrated here. So you take some material, for instance silicon, then implant with ion implantation materials which are not soluble here. Typical example is gold. You can implant gold into silicon or silicon dioxide, and due to the implantation you of course get the usual depth distribution of this atom at random positions in the lattice. This is the same thing we discussed in the first 3 sections of this course. But then if you heat the sample, things get interesting, because then if the material implanted like gold is not soluble, since it's not soluble in silicon, it starts to migrate and cluster, but if they are deep enough, they won't make it to the surface, but when they find each other, they start forming nanoclusters in the sample. Furthermore, by doing this adding irradiation there, one can sometimes make almost equisized nanoclusters layers by using an approach known as sorry, now I'm slightly confused. This is the initial stage, but then when you heat up, you can get a layer of them by a process known as Ostwald ripening, which means that the smaller clusters start emitting atoms, and these would join the larger cluster, and then one can get a nanocluster layer similar to what's shown here. And this is a picture of what this can be looking experimentally. So in this case, there was a silicon, this was the bulk silicon on here. Then there was a silicon dioxide layer, pretty thick, several hundreds of nanometers, into which germanium was irradiated from this direction. Then after heating to 1200 degrees C, you see that each dot, these small black darker dots here, are germanium nanoclusters inside the silica matrix. And here is an atomic image of what this may look like: small silicon nanoclusters or larger silicon nanoclusters, which are can be obtained and constructed in molecular dynamics simulation. And also in germanium, we know that the germanium nanocluster in silica looks pretty much like this. You have a beautiful germanium nanocrystal surrounded by then a complicated silica matrix. Finally, this is what you should have learned from this section. I again won't read it aloud, but I'll leave you a moment to read it.